All right, good morning, everyone. We're going to start with the new chapter today, and it's the chemistry of microbiology. So, a lot of this should be familiar to you. You've covered this in chemistry already, or you've covered this in biology last year. So, two definitions to start off is matter, and matter is anything that takes up space and has mass, and then atoms, which are the smallest chemical unit of matter. So we have the atomic structure. So we have electrons, which are negatively charged particles, circulating the nucleus. The nucleus that contains uh, neutrons and protons. Neutrons are uncharged particles, and then protons are positively charged particles. So here we can see a Bohr model. So you've got protons and electrons here in the center. We've got our electrons shells and then our electrons on the outside. Here, we are going to talk about the element, atomic number, and atomic mass. So an element is composed of a single type of atom, so it would just be hydrogen or oxygen. An atomic number is equal to the number of protons in the nucleus. The atomic weight is the sum of masses of protons, neutrons, and electrons. So here we can see common elements for life. So hydrogen, symbol is H, atomic number is 1. So on and so forth. This should be very, very familiar. What I want to draw your attention to is the biological significance. So hydrogen, components of organic molecules in water. Hydrogen ions are released by acids, essential for plant growth, for boron, backbone of organic molecules for carbon, component of amino acids, proteins, and nucleic acids for nitrogen. Oxygen is a component of many organic molecules and water. Hydronium ions are released by bases. These are necessary for anaerobic metabolism. Sodium is the principal cation outside the cell. Magnesium is component for energy transforming enzymes. So on and so forth. I would take a time to write these down and know what significance they have. I'm so sorry. Isotopes are atoms of given elements that differ in the number of neutrons in their nucleus. So we have a stable isotope, which is just something that has 1 or 2 extra neutrons that does not do anything and is perfectly fine. An unstable isotope is a radioactive isotope. And these start to decay and they release energy during this decay, and that's called radioactive decay. So things that are like this are going to be uranium. They're going to want to get rid of those neutrons, so they're going to start decaying. So here we can see carbon 12, which is our neutral, normal carbon. Carbon 13 has 1 extra neutron, and carbon 14 has 2 extra neutrons. And we use these to look at decay and archaeology. So we can look at the carbon 13 decay because we know the half-life, which is how long it takes for that to lose that neutron, and see how much is left. So the electron configurations is only the electrons of atoms interact so that they determine the atom's chemical behavior. So you should all know this from chemistry. Only the electrons in the outer valence electron shell interact, and they want to have a full valence electron shell. So they're going to either gain or lose or share an electron to make them happy. So here we can see a couple of different configurations of how we can draw. them. So we have neon with a 3-dimensional electron shell. So we've got the first shell, the second shell, and then we can see them all put together. Or we can do it in a 2-dimensional way with the first and the second, and then you add them together. You can see neon has a full electron shell on the outside. You have to fill one electron shell before you can move on to the other. So here's a board diagram for the first 20 elements within the chart for their valence electron shells. So you can see chlorine's missing one, so it's going to want to add or react with one to make that filled. Or sodium. So chlorine and sodium come together to make salt. So the first, tell me why. Electrons zip around the nucleus about 5 million miles per hour. Why don't some of them fly off? All right, so chemical bonds. Valence is combining capacity for an atom. So a positive atom has to give up electrons. Negative atoms have spaces to fill. And it's stable when the outer valence shell electron contains 2 if it has only 1, or 8 electron shells. And how are they going to do this? They're going to form chemical bonds. So atoms combine together by sharing or transferring valence electrons to fill that outer shell. A molecule is when 2 or more atoms are held together by a chemical bond. So this would be sodium chlorine. The salt, that's a molecule. A molecule I'm sorry, I mixed that up. A molecule would be like H2. It's 2 or more atoms held together by a chemical bond. Typically, it's the same one. The compound is a molecule composed of more than one element, so that would be sodium chloride. So we have 2 different types of bonds we're going to talk about. We have covalent bonds and ionic bonds. So covalent bonds share a pair of electrons between the 2 atoms, and they have electronegativity. So some atoms attract the electron more than others. So the more electronegative an atom is, the greater the pull of the nucleus exerts on the electron. So it's going to pull that new electron in closer and hold on to it longer. And that's where we get polar and nonpolar. So we can see the electronegativity values here, right? Our noble gases are going to have no electronegativity, and our guys on the end are going to have pretty high electronegativity because they're going to want to get that atom, and they're going to want to get rid of it over here. So nonpolar covalent bonds are shared electrons that spend equal amount of time around an atom. So they're going to be linear almost. The atoms have similar electronegativity, and there's no poles. So that's why there's nonpolar. I kind of think of the Earth has 2 poles, so it's going to pull in opposite directions. This one has no poles, so it's going to be nice and equal. Carbon atoms have 4 nonpolar covalent bonds with other atoms. So this makes organic compounds, and these typically are carbon and hydrogen. So we can see here 2 hydrogen bonds together. We're going to have a covalent nonpolar bond. Here we've got 2 oxygens, covalent nonpolar bond. Carbon dioxide is another example of a nonpolar covalent bond. See, methane, nonpolar. Formaldehyde, nonpolar. So polar is unequal sharing. They're going to have poles. So you're going to have a positive on one end and a negative on the other. It's because they have different electronegativities. The most important polar covalent bond involves hydrogen. This allows for hydrogen bonds. We're going to see this in water. So you can see water here. You can see that this is a negative pole up here, a positive pole down here, and there's about a 150-degree angle in those bonds. So the other type of bond we're going to talk about is ionic bond, because they're iconic. It occurs when two atoms are vastly different electronegativities come together. The atoms either have positive, so they're a cation, or negative, where they're an anion, and they have those charges. So positive charge, negative charge, cation, because they're positive, negative, anion, because they're annoyed. Cations and anions attract each other to form ionic bonds. These electrons are not shared. They are typically given. They typically form a crystallized ionic compound structure known as salts. So sodium chlorine is going to make salt. So we can see sodium loses an electron to chlorine. Chlorine becomes negatively charged. Salt becomes positively charged. They're going to attract each other and form an ionic bond that then becomes sodium chlorine or salt, which is a crystalline structure. They like to group together because of those charges. But water does this amazing thing where it will pull them apart and completely dissociate those bonds. So you can see that sodium is completely surrounded with the oxygen, while chlorine is completely surrounded by the hydrogen because of those different poles. So, what is hydrogen bonding? I keep talking about it. It's the electrical attraction between those partially charged hydrogen ions and fully or partially negative charge of the same or different molecule. So we saw it with the salt. We can see it with water itself. These are weaker than covalent bonds, but essential for life because it helps hold together the 3D structure of larger molecules. So it's going to help hold together our proteins. So we can see it here. We've got hydrogen bonds between all of our bases in our DNA. So we've got cysteine and guanine, and they're going to come together with that hydrogen bond to create that backbone that creates our DNA. So here's a quick little table about the different characteristics of chemical bonds. So last tell me why of today. Tell me why chlorine and potassium atoms form ionic bonds, carbon atoms form nonpolar covalent bonds, and nitrogen atoms and oxygen form polar covalent bonds with phosphorus. Explain these bonds and explain why these bonds are the types of what they are. So I'm not going to have you answer it on here. I'm going to have you go to the next assignment and answer it there.